20 years later, I arrived at my daughter's house, which I gave her, but I saw her asleep on the door rug. She was in old rags, and her husband was wiping his feet on her and telling the guests, "This is my crazy maid." I didn't scream. I took a step forward, and everyone frozen because, greetings, dear listeners. Before I begin telling this complicated story of my life, I ask you to support our channel. Subscribe, leave a like, and write in the comments which city you are listening from. This is very important for us. And now, enjoy listening. I felt a flutter of excitement as my car rolled to a stop in front of the suburban home I had given Emily 20 years ago. The streets were lined with trees, their leaves catching the sunlight in flickers of gold and green, and for a moment, I allowed myself to imagine the house as I had always pictured it in my mind, filled with laughter, warmth, and the soft hum of a life well lived. Memories came rushing back like waves I hadn't realized I'd held in reserve. I remembered the day I handed her the keys, the way her eyes had sparkled, the tears streaking down her cheeks as she whispered over and over, "Thank you, Mom. Thank you." That had been my dream for her: security, happiness, freedom. I had imagined her waking up every morning in a sunlit kitchen, the smell of coffee drifting through the room she called her own, her life unfolding with the quiet dignity I had always hoped for her. I took a deep breath, trying to calm the fluttering in my chest. I hadn't seen her in years, 20 to be exact. Time had a way of distorting memory, of making one forget the cracks in people's smiles, the wariness that eventually creeps into even the brightest eyes. I reminded myself to expect some change, a few signs of age, maybe a touch of fatigue, but nothing could have prepared me for what awaited on the doorstep. I opened the front gate, expecting the familiar warmth of my daughter's greeting. Instead, I froze. My chest tightened, the air seeming to constrict around me. There she was, Emily, my Emily, asleep on the door rug. Her once vibrant hair was matted and tangled, hanging in uneven strands across her face. Her skin was pale, almost translucent in the sunlight, and her body was draped in old, tattered rags that barely resembled clothing. My stomach churned, my mind struggling to reconcile the image before me with the girl I had raised. I blinked, hoping that if I looked away, it would be a trick of the light, a cruel hallucination. But no, she was there, lying as if she were nothing, as if the years of love, guidance, and care I had poured into her life meant nothing at all. And then he came into view. Mark, my daughter's husband, strutting past her with a smug arrogance that made my skin crawl. He paused, deliberately wiping his shoes across her back, and then turned to his guests with a flourish. "This is my crazy maid," he declared, voice loud and dripping with mockery. The guests laughed, or pretended to, shifting uncomfortably in the bright afternoon sun. But I saw the unease in their eyes, the subtle recognition that something was deeply wrong. For a heartbeat, I felt my entire body tighten with a rage I hadn't allowed myself to feel in years. Every instinct screamed at me to shout, to storm forward, to tear him away from her. But I forced myself to remain calm. I didn't scream. I didn't panic. I simply stepped forward. My footfall was deliberate, slow, measured. And the moment I moved, the world seemed to pause. Every head in the yard turned toward me. The laughter died instantly, replaced by a dense, oppressive silence. I felt the weight of dozens of eyes pressing on me, their attention sharp, expectant, uncomfortable. I could see the realization dawning in Mark's face. He had underestimated me, this woman he had never truly known. He had assumed that because I was older, because I had not been present, because I had trusted him to treat Emily with decency, I would do nothing. He had assumed wrong. I knelt briefly beside Emily, not yet touching her, my eyes taking in the full scope of her condition. The ragged clothing, the hollowed cheeks, the despair etched into every line of her face. And I realized with a mixture of fury and sorrow that for the first time in decades I held the power. Not physical power, not wealth, but the moral authority of a mother who had witnessed injustice and refused to turn away. I drew in a long breath, feeling the anger and grief coil tightly in my chest, a rope of fire that I was determined to control, to channel. My voice did not yet break the silence, but my presence did. It was enough. The air itself seemed to tremble with the expectation of what was about to happen, and I knew that the coming moments would not merely change the atmosphere. They would change the trajectory of Emily's life. I did not need to scream. I did not need to strike. My step forward, my refusal to be intimidated, my unwavering gaze upon Mark and the assembled guests spoke louder than any words. And in that instant, I felt the weight of 20 years lift slightly, replaced by the first spark of justice I would ignite. I would reclaim my daughter, her home, and her dignity, and nothing in the world would stand in my way. My mind spun in dizzying circles, unable to comprehend the scene before me. How could this have happened? My Emily, the bright, warm, compassionate girl I had spent my life raising, lying on the doorstep in rags, her body sprawled across the welcome mat of a home I had given her as a gift. I had imagined this house filled with her laughter, sunlight streaming through the windows as she moved freely, and now it was a stage for her degradation. My chest ached, a sharp, unrelenting pain that clawed its way into my bones. I felt a hollow rage gnaw at me, a mixture of heartbreak and fury that made my hands tremble. I knelt beside her, forcing myself to take deliberate, steadying breaths. My fingers shook as I reached for her shoulder and gently shook her awake. The sight of her eyes fluttering open nearly broke me in two. They were wide with fear, rimmed with red, yet when they landed on me, a spark, fragile, fleeting, of recognition and hope flickered there. It was a look that said, "Mom, is it really you?" And for a heartbeat, the world's cruelty receded, and all I could focus on was the daughter I had known, hidden beneath layers of humiliation and abuse. Her hair, once soft and glossy, clung to her face in tangled strands. Her skin, pale and drawn, carried the shadows of sleepless nights and endless servitude. I traced the lines of exhaustion and despair, memorizing every detail, letting my anger ferment quietly beneath the surface. I could feel the unfairness of it all, the years Mark had taken, the stolen dignity, the betrayal of trust, and it coiled around me like a living thing, making my chest tighten, making my hands ache to act, to strike, to scream. I raised my gaze slowly, deliberately, and locked eyes with Mark. His expression had shifted slightly, a flicker of unease crossing his features, but it was brief, quickly replaced by smugness. He assumed I would be powerless, that I would stand by and watch as he flaunted his cruelty. He had underestimated me, and that was his first mistake. Beneath my calm exterior, anger simmered, a slow-burning flame that threatened to ignite at any moment. I let it sit there, controlled, restrained, because I knew I had to be deliberate. I had to be precise. "This ends today," I said, my voice low, but carrying a weight that seemed to press down on the very air. It was quiet, almost conversational, but every syllable bore the force of decades of maternal protection and pent-up rage. I felt it vibrate through me, resonate outward into the frozen air of the yard. The guests, who had been laughing moments before, shifted uncomfortably. Some avoided my eyes. Others exchanged whispered glances, the first signs that they sensed the imbalance, the sudden reversal of power. Something had changed in the dynamics of the scene. Mark, who had been the center of attention, the orchestrator of mockery, was suddenly no longer the one in control. I reached out to steady Emily, my hands trembling only slightly as I pulled her upright. Her body was frail under my touch, but her gaze stayed on mine, anchored by the recognition that I was here, that I had returned for her, that I was not going to leave her in this state. I could feel the raw weight of her pain, the years of fear and submission, and it cut into me with a sharpness that made my stomach turn. How had I not known? How had she endured this in silence, under the roof of a home meant to be hers, where I had thought she was safe? The betrayal, the sheer scope of it, made my hands clench into fists. Yet, as I held her, as I looked into those eyes that were part despair and part fragile hope, I realized that this pain, this shock, was not only a wound. It was also a spark. I could feel the first stirrings of resolve rising within me. The world had shifted, and in that moment, I knew I had the power to change it. Not through yelling or panic, not through uncontrolled fury, but through deliberate, unwavering presence. The silence in the yard deepened, heavy and expectant. Every guest, every witness, could feel the tension, the promise that something was about to happen. I didn't need to shout. My voice, quiet and measured, carried authority. My presence alone, kneeling beside Emily, radiated protection and judgment. I knew Mark felt it too. I knew Mark felt it too. Charged silence. I understood something crucial. This moment, this confrontation was mine to shape. The pain of seeing my daughter like this was sharp, but it was also the beginning of a new reality, a reality where her suffering could end, where justice could begin, and where I would not allow fear or cruelty to hold sway in my daughter's life ever again. Emily's voice was barely audible, a fragile thread of sound that trembled against the oppressive heat of humiliation that hung over the yard. "Mom, he's controlled me for years," she whispered, her lips quivering. My stomach clenched as I leaned closer, straining to catch each word. The confession poured out like a dam breaking. Mark had belittled her at every opportunity, stolen the inheritance I had worked decades to provide, turned the home I had given her into a prison where she was a servant to his whims. My daughter's life, her dignity, every scrap of freedom she had been entitled to, had been systematically erased, piece by piece, by the man I had once trusted to love and protect her. My chest ached, not just with pain, but with a surge of something fiercer, sharper, a fire igniting that spread from my heart into my limbs, rooting me to the moment with fierce clarity. I looked at her, this young woman I had nurtured into strength, now bent and broken by years of deceit. The sight was almost unbearable, yet within it I saw a spark, tiny and stubborn, flickering in her eyes as they met mine. I reached for her hand, trembling with rage, trembling with hope, and pressed it firmly, grounding her, reminding her she was no longer alone. "Emily, you're not alone anymore," I whispered, my voice steady, resonant, filled with a determination that had crystallized over the decades of worry, absence, and finally, confrontation. She clung to that tiny hope as if it were a lifeline, her fingers curling around mine with a tentative strength, a silent promise that we would not surrender. I glanced over the yard, at the guests and neighbors who had gathered under the pretense of celebration, and caught the eyes of those I trusted most. There were a few who had long known the truth, friends who had seen the subtle cruelty of Mark's control, neighbors who had noticed Emily's slow withdrawal, the faint shadows of fear behind her polite smiles in social interactions. They were the ones who had quietly watched, empathetic and attentive, the keepers of her secret misery. Now I nodded at them subtly, a signal to stand with us. Their eyes widened in recognition, and I saw the flicker of solidarity ignite in their expressions. Hope, I realized, was no longer a solitary flame. It had become a small conflagration, a network of support that would not allow Mark's tyranny to continue unchecked. Emily's gaze followed mine as I made the silent call to our allies. I could see the first traces of courage returning to her posture, the slight straightening of her back, the tentative lift of her chin. The rags clinging to her body no longer defined her entirely. They were temporary, superficial markers of a suffering that was ending. For the first time in years, she was looking outward, scanning the faces of our witnesses, calculating that maybe, just maybe, justice was within reach. I felt a warmth rise inside me, a sensation of fierce maternal pride mingled with relief. This was the moment when fear could begin to be replaced by empowerment, when the victim could start becoming the heroine of her own life story. I pressed a hand gently against her cheek, letting my fingers brush the dampness of her tears. "You have strength, Emily," I said, softly but firmly. "You always have. You just had no one to help you see it. But you're not alone anymore, and we have witnesses. We have allies, and together, we'll make sure this stops." Her eyes glistened with a mixture of disbelief and cautious hope. The fear that had once dominated her every expression now contended with something stronger, the realization that the years of manipulation, control, and cruelty did not have to define her future. Mark, still standing near the center of the yard, shifted uneasily, though he did not yet fully grasp the significance of what was happening. I could see the cracks forming in his carefully constructed arrogance. The presence of our allies, our neighbors, our shared recognition of his abuses, it made him momentarily vulnerable. Hope, I realized, was not just a feeling. It was a force that could crack even the most rigid defenses when wielded with precision, patience, and truth. I kept my hand in Emily's, grounding her as we both silently acknowledged the unspoken truth. The first step toward justice had begun. It was not a grand gesture, not yet. It was a quiet, deliberate assertion of power, of truth, of unwavering commitment to her safety and dignity. And as her eyes brightened, just slightly, I felt a heat of possibility bloom in my chest. We were no longer isolated, no longer invisible. We had witnesses. We had allies. We had hope. And hope, I knew in that moment, was the beginning of change. For the first time in years, Emily's voice lifted a little, her whisper carrying more weight. "Mom, maybe it really can end." I smiled softly, though my chest still burned with anger and pain. "Yes, my child," I thought, "it can end, and it will." We would not allow another second of this cruelty to persist. The path forward was uncertain, fraught with confrontation and risk, but it was now ours to walk. Hope was our first step, and nothing, no one, could take it from us. I drew in a deep, steady breath, letting it fill me from the soles of my feet to the top of my head. The anger that had been smoldering inside me for decades, silent, patient, waiting, now surged to the surface like a tide breaking against a dam. My eyes fixed on Mark, and I let my voice ring out, clear, unwavering, and sharp as glass. "Mark, 20 years of cruelty, and you dare humiliate her in front of guests. This is her home, her life." Each word landed with weight, slicing through the complacent chatter of the yard. For a moment he froze, and I saw the first flicker of hesitation in his eyes. Then he laughed, a hollow, dismissive sound, brushing off my words with the kind of arrogance I had come to despise. "She's crazy. She needs discipline," he said, waving a hand as if my presence, my anger, my very outrage were inconsequential. The sound of it made my blood boil, but I forced myself to remain composed. I had learned long ago that fury unchecked could be dangerous to the one it belonged to. This time, I would use it as a weapon, precise and controlled. The guests had grown still, shifting in uneasy murmurs. Some glanced at one another, whispering, questioning, caught between disbelief and the instinctive discomfort of witnessing something dark and unspoken. I realized with a sudden surge of satisfaction that my calm presence, years of tempered resilience and quiet authority, was unsettling Mark in a way he had never expected. He had thrived on fear and control, but now facing me, his carefully cultivated arrogance faltered. He did not yet understand that I was not merely a mother seeking justice. I was a force sharpened by decades of patience and righteous anger. I stepped closer, closing the space between us, letting the weight of my presence press against him. My heart pounded, not with fear, but with the kind of righteous fury that demanded recognition. I could see the beads of sweat forming at his temple, the twitch in his jaw, the subtle trembling of the hands that had so long inflicted power over my daughter. He was unsteady now, and I could feel it, savor it. I lifted my hand, pointing toward the gathered witnesses. "Everyone here," I said, my voice firm and commanding. "Look at him. Look at what he has done. This is not discipline. This is not love. This is tyranny. He has stolen 20 years of her life, her happiness, her freedom, and he has done it while pretending to the world that all is normal." My words resonated across the yard, filling the space with an undeniable truth. The murmurs of guests grew louder, questions whispered to one another, eyes darting to Mark with suspicion, now replacing their earlier awkward amusement. Mark's bravado began to falter. He cleared his throat, trying to salvage the facade, but the weight of my accusation, paired with the unspoken solidarity of the witnesses, gnawed at his confidence. I demanded proof, not in the form of threats, not in the form of violence, but the kind of incontrovertible truth that could expose his deception. Letters, receipts, photographs, testimony. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, I saw the cracks forming in the armor of his arrogance. The anger I had carried, unspoken and unvented for 20 years, coiled inside me like a living thing. It had grown patient, biding its time while I watched my daughter suffer in silence. But now, in this single, electric moment, I could finally channel it. My words, my gestures, my presence, all of it became a controlled, inevitable force. Every lie he had told, every insult he had whispered, every moment of fear he had instilled in Emily came to the surface, and I met it with unyielding clarity. I spoke again, my voice lower now, almost a growl, but deliberate, filled with the weight of decades of maternal love and rage combined. "You will not ignore me. You will not ignore her. You will face what you have done, and you will answer for it." My gaze swept the yard, locking eyes with neighbors, friends, anyone who might falter in the presence of truth. I demand witnesses. I demand the truth, and you, Mark, cannot escape it. I saw him swallow hard, the mask of control slipping further with every second. He had built his life on intimidation, on the silent complicity of others, but now the air was shifting. He was isolated in a way he had never been before. My presence, my voice, my righteous anger, it was a weight he could not bear. I felt the crowd leaning in, silently backing me, lending me the strength that only a shared understanding of injustice can provide. For the first time in 20 years, I felt the scales beginning to tip. My fury, tempered by patience and sharpened by love, had become a weapon of undeniable force. The confrontation was not yet over, but Mark could no longer hide behind lies or mockery. The first cracks had appeared, and I could see the fear in his eyes, small, flickering, but unmistakable. He was beginning to understand that he was not dealing with a frightened wife, a passive victim, or a powerless mother. He was dealing with me, and I would not be ignored, not this time. I could feel my hands trembling as I reached into my bag, pulling out the first of the items I had brought: letters, receipts, photographs, all carefully preserved over the years. Each piece told a story I had never wanted to believe, but had always feared. Emily's handwriting, her frantic pleas hidden between the lines of casual correspondence, receipts for purchases that Mark had forced her to make, never reimbursed, every transaction a testament to his manipulation. Photographs showing Emily working tirelessly in her own home, while he posed in front of the cameras as the proud husband, the kind man, the caretaker she had never been allowed to be. I placed them on the table in front of the guests, letting them fall naturally into view, and watched as eyes widened, whispers rose, and the air thickened with the weight of unspoken truths. For the first time in decades, the carefully constructed illusion Mark had built began to crumble in the presence of undeniable evidence. The house that had been his stage, where he flaunted his control, now bore witness to the reality he had fought so hard to hide. Then I saw her, Mark's sister, shift uncomfortably near the edge of the gathering. I had expected silence from her, perhaps denial, but what came next pierced through the tension like a blade. Her voice trembled, faltering at first, but then gathering strength. I knew, she admitted, glancing nervously at Mark. I helped him. I thought I was protecting the family, but I only kept her trapped. She stopped, choking on her words. The weight of guilt was heavy in the air, and for the first time, her complicity was no longer hidden behind polite smiles or polite silence. The room felt smaller, heavier, as betrayal layered upon betrayal settled into every corner. My chest tightened, but I forced myself to stay calm. My eyes swept over Emily, who had been silent until that moment, her face pale but attentive. I could feel her tension, her fear, but also the tiniest spark of something I had longed to see, recognition that she was not alone, that the truth was finally emerging. My presence, my voice, my actions had created a space where she could finally find her own courage. And then she spoke. Her voice was quiet at first, almost fragile, trembling with the weight of years of suppression, but it grew stronger with every word. I am not your servant, she said, looking directly at Mark. Her eyes, once filled with resignation, now burned with determination. I am my own person, and this ends now. I could feel the resonance of her words ripple through the crowd, an electric charge of defiance that no one could ignore. I watched her shoulders straighten, her chin lift, and the flicker of her spirit return. That spirit, which Mark had tried to bury beneath humiliation, fear, and control, now shone faintly but unmistakably. I felt my own chest swell with a mixture of pride, relief, and lingering anger. This was the moment we had been waiting for, the first undeniable shift in the battle that had raged silently for years. I reached out and placed my hand gently on Emily's arm. She flinched only slightly, then leaned into the touch, as if drawing strength from the fact that I was there, unwavering. Look at them, I said softly, gesturing to the witnesses who had quietly offered their support. They see the truth. You are not alone. This ends because we are standing together. Mark's face had gone pale. His arrogance, which had carried him through years of cruelty, faltered under the weight of proof, confession, and Emily's courage. He opened his mouth, likely to protest, to deny, to manipulate, but no words came that could undo what had been revealed. The evidence, the witnesses, the confession of his own sister, and most importantly, Emily's reclamation of her voice formed a circle of truth that could not be broken. As I looked around the yard, I noticed the subtle shifts in the crowd, heads nodding in understanding, eyes glinting with quiet admiration, murmurs of approval and outrage at the injustice laid bare. The social barrier that Mark had relied upon to maintain his dominance was crumbling. The walls of pretense, built carefully over years, were cracking under the combined force of truth and courage. I felt a surge of hope that Emily could finally breathe, hope that the life she had been denied could be reclaimed, hope that the house, her house, could once again become a sanctuary instead of a cage. And more than that, I felt hope for myself. Hope that the years of watching, worrying, and waiting had not been in vain. Hope that my love, patience, and unwavering presence had played a part in bringing her back to herself. Emily straightened further, her hands clenched at her sides, her voice steady now. I saw in her the woman I had always known existed beneath the fear and subjugation, the woman who had been buried but never broken. And in that moment, surrounded by evidence, truth, and witnesses, I realized something profound. The battle was no longer just about anger or revenge. It was about reclaiming life, dignity, and identity. I inhaled, letting the tension wash over me, and exhaled slowly. Together, Emily and I stood, side by side, against the darkness Mark had cast over our lives. The twists of truth, long hidden and carefully buried, had finally emerged, and with them came the first genuine promise of justice, restoration, and freedom. I watched Mark's figure shrink toward the driveway, his posture rigid, his usual arrogance replaced with a tension he could not mask. He was cornered by evidence, by witnesses, and by the undeniable truth of the years he had stolen from Emily. The guests, once unsure, now looked on with a mixture of relief, disbelief, and quiet vindication. Their eyes traced his retreating form as though the very air had shifted to witness his downfall. Every step he took away from the house felt like a reclaiming of space, a clearing of shadows that had lingered too long. For the first time in decades, Emily's home was no longer a cage. I stepped forward and felt the weight of 20 years settle into my shoulders, but this time it was a weight I could bear with purpose. Emily turned to me, her eyes wide, scanning the faces of neighbors and friends who had stood silently beside us. There was fear there, yes, lingering like a shadow, but it was overlaid with something brighter, something fragile yet unyielding, the spark of regained freedom. I wanted to reach out and sweep her into my arms, to shield her from the memory of the torment she had endured, but I knew that this moment was hers. She needed to claim it herself, to feel the liberation as her own. "Mom," her voice trembled, almost breaking, and I felt a sharp pang in my chest. But then she squared her shoulders and inhaled deeply, as if drawing courage from the very air of the house. I nodded, silently telling her that she was not alone, that she had survived, that she had won. Together, we began to move through the rooms, each step echoing against walls that had witnessed humiliation, deceit, and fear. The living room, where Mark had once staged his cruelty in front of guests, felt different now, hollow but expectant, like a vessel ready to be filled with life again. I handed her a cloth and a spray bottle, and we started with the surfaces that had borne the weight of oppression. Tables polished to a reflective gleam, countertops cleared of the remnants of manipulation, shelves dusted of the residue of control. Every sweep, every motion, was an act of reclaiming, an assertion that this house belonged to her and her alone. She paused occasionally, touching a spot on the wall, a mark on the floor, a piece of furniture, and for a brief moment, I saw the shadows of the past flicker in her eyes. Then, just as quickly, they were replaced by determination. Her spirit was rising, slowly, but unmistakably, from the depths where Mark had buried it. We moved room by room. The kitchen, once a theater of her servitude, became a place of empowerment. I reminded her that she could cook, arrange, and organize for herself now, that no one would belittle or control her here again. In the bedrooms, we opened closets and drawers, discarding items that reminded her of subjugation, preserving only what brought comfort, memory, and identity. She laughed quietly when she discovered a forgotten photograph of herself as a child. Sunlight catching the edges of her hair, her smile unbroken by the years to come. It was a small sound, almost inaudible, but it felt monumental in the silence left by Mark's absence. I watched her hands move across surfaces, arranging and rearranging, placing things in the precise order that felt right to her. Each deliberate action was a declaration. This house, this life, this moment belonged to Emily. Her eyes, once hollow and shadowed by despair, now held a glimmer of freedom, a sparkle that seemed almost impossible to have been extinguished after 20 years of oppression. Every glance, every gesture, carried weight. She was learning to trust herself again, to inhabit her own life after years of living for someone else's control. We paused in the center of the living room, taking in the work we had done together. Dust motes floated in the sunlight streaming through the windows, and the house seemed to breathe around us, as if exhaling the tension and fear that had long lingered within its walls. I felt a surge of emotion, pride, relief, and awe all at once. Emily was no longer a shadow of her former self. She was emerging as the woman she had always been, resilient, courageous, and unbroken. I put my hand on her shoulder, feeling the warmth and solidity of her presence. "You did this," I whispered. "You survived. You took back your life." Her lips quivered in response, and a tear slipped down her cheek, but it was not a tear of sorrow. It was a tear of triumph, of reclamation, of the pure, unfiltered joy of finally being free. In that moment, standing side by side, I realized something profound. Strength does not diminish with age, and courage does not fade with time. Even after decades of darkness, of control and fear, a spirit determined to rise will find its way to the light. Emily had done it, and I had been honored to witness and guide her through the first steps of reclaiming the life that had always been hers. And as we stood there, in the home she had been denied for so long, I knew that the triumph was not just for Emily. It was for all of us who had waited, watched, and believed that justice, dignity, and the human spirit could not be extinguished, no matter how long the shadow had lasted. I stood in the center of the freshly restored living room, my arms instinctively wrapping around Emily as if to shield her, as if to reassure her that the world she had lost could finally be hers again. The scent of polished wood, of sunlight spilling through the windows, and of curtains freshly laundered filled the room. Every corner seemed alive, resonant with the echoes of the life she had once been denied. I felt a shiver run through me, not from cold, but from the intensity of what we had accomplished. Tears streamed freely down my face, hot and unrestrained, not of grief, but of triumph. They were the tears of a mother who had fought, who had borne witness to cruelty, and who had helped restore her child to her rightful place in the world. Emily pressed against me, trembling slightly, but the tremor was no longer fear. It was relief. It was wonder. It was the fragile, beautiful awareness of freedom regained. I pulled back slightly and took in her face. Her eyes, so long dulled by oppression, glimmered now with light and clarity. The corners of her mouth lifted into a tentative smile, and I felt my chest swell with a fierce, protective pride. She had endured 20 years of control, humiliation, and isolation, yet here she stood, or rather, here she leaned, steadied by my presence, and she was beginning to breathe in the full measure of her life. It was intoxicating, seeing her step into herself again, reclaiming each stolen moment, each corner of her existence. I realized then that age and time, far from diminishing my strength, had only refined it. I had learned patience, resilience, and the measured force of love tempered by years of understanding what was worth fighting for. I had faced injustice head-on, had stared it in the face and refused to blink, and I had emerged victorious, not only for myself, but for Emily, who had been trapped in shadows that were never hers to endure. Standing here, I understood that the courage we needed had always been within us. It merely required awakening. Emily's courage, intertwined with the unwavering constancy of a mother's love, had become a story in itself, a narrative of survival, a testament to the power of endurance, and a living example of hope renewed. I held her closer, inhaling the faint scent of her hair, brushing away a strand that had fallen across her forehead. "This is your life, Emily," I whispered, my voice trembling with a combination of relief and certainty. "Your home, your choices, your freedom. Never let anyone take it from you again. Not ever." My words felt monumental in the quiet of the room, heavier than any command or declaration, but softer than any threat I had ever wielded. They were a promise and a reminder that she could now, finally, walk through her own life on her own terms. She lifted her face, her eyes glistening, reflecting the sunlight that streamed in like liquid gold, and she met my gaze with a quiet strength I had not seen for decades. "I won't, Mom," she said, her voice steadying with each word. "I finally see what it feels like to be truly free." The word struck me with a beauty that was almost painful to witness. Simple, declarative, undeniable. Freedom, it seemed, was not just the absence of chains, but the reclamation of one's own spirit, one's own choices, one's own identity. And Emily had claimed it. We stepped back and surveyed the room, and through the open windows, the garden beyond. Sunlight spilled across the floors, illuminating each corner with a warmth that felt almost sacred. I realized that the house itself, once a stage for Mark's cruelty, had transformed alongside Emily. The walls no longer carried whispers of fear. The furniture no longer bore witness to humiliation. Everything seemed to radiate possibility, as if the very air had shifted, acknowledging her triumph and our collective journey from pain to empowerment. In that moment, standing together amid the sunlight and the quiet hum of a home reclaimed, I understood something profound. Courage, when paired with steadfast love, can overcome decades of cruelty. Time cannot erode what is nourished by truth, by determination, by the refusal to accept oppression as permanent. Emily's spirit had been tested, battered, and restrained, yet it had emerged stronger, refined, and radiant. We had transformed her fear into inspiration, her suffering into triumph, and the shadows of her past into the light of her future. I drew her close once more, pressing my cheek to hers, and let the silence stretch between us. Comfortable, whole, filled with the knowledge that what had been taken could now never be stolen again. And as I looked around at her home, at the space that was entirely hers now, I felt the quiet, unshakable certainty that love and courage, even after decades of trials, could restore what had been lost, could renew what had been broken, and could inspire not just one life, but everyone who witnessed it.